Picture this. You're 63 years old, maybe 68. You've fixed carburetors that shouldn't run, weathered storms that knocked out power for a week, and you've got the kind of practical sense that comes from 4 decades of solving problems with your hands. You think you know what tough looks like. Then life throws you a curveball that makes all those previous challenges look like Sunday crossword puzzles. Maybe it's a natural disaster that's leveled your town. Maybe it's a situation where the grid's down, the roads are impassable, and help isn't coming anytime soon. Or maybe it's something simpler but just as deadly. You're lost, injured, and facing a night that'll drop to 20 below. Suddenly, that dark opening in the hillside starts looking less like something from a horror movie and more like the only thing standing between you and becoming a statistic. Welcome to the reality of cave survival. And brother, it's nothing like what you see in the movies, the fantasy versus the reality. Most folks think of caves the way they think about camping, just with a stone roof instead of a tent. Free shelter, ready-made, dry as your old workshop. What could go wrong? Here's what could go wrong. Damn near everything. I've spent the better part of 30 years talking to search and rescue teams, cave experts, and the handful of people who've actually lived through extended cave survival situations. And let me tell you something. The difference between fantasy and reality is measured in hours, not days. The guys who make it out alive aren't the ones who thought it would be easy. They're the ones who understood from minute one that they just entered a world with completely different rules. Think about your basement in January. Cold, damp, maybe 55 degrees even, with the furnace running upstairs. Now imagine that basement is made of solid stone, has no electric lights, no furnace, and the temperature never changes. Day or night, summer or winter. That's your new home. And unlike your basement, this one might flood, might collapse, might fill with invisible gases that'll put you to sleep permanently. Oh, and there's no door to the outside world whenever you feel like leaving. Why this isn't just another survival story. Now you might be wondering why we're spending time on something that seems so unlikely. After all, what are the odds you'll ever need to hole up in a cave? Well, let me ask you this. What were the odds that a hurricane would park itself over Houston for 4 days straight? What were the odds that a wildfire would jump 8 lanes of interstate and burn down Paradise, California? What were the odds that a winter storm would knock out power grids across Texas for a week? The thing about survival situations is they don't politely wait for you to be ready. They don't care if you're retired, if you've got a bad back, or if you haven't camped since the Carter administration. They just happen. And when they do, the knowledge you have in your head is the only equipment you can count on. But here's the real reason this matters. Understanding cave survival teaches you something bigger. It teaches you how to think clearly when everything familiar disappears. It teaches you how to make life or death decisions with incomplete information. And it teaches you the kind of practical problem solving that applies whether you're dealing with a cave, a blizzard, or any other situation where the normal rules stop working. Plus, and I'll be straight with you here, there are more caves in America than you might think. From the limestone caverns of Kentucky to the lava tubes of the Pacific Northwest. From the sandstone overhangs of Utah to the granite shelters of New Hampshire, natural caves and rock shelters exist in every state. And in a real emergency, knowing how to use one safely might be the difference between a survival story and a tragedy. The 3 types of cave survivors. In all my research, I've found that people who end up living in caves fall into 3 categories, and understanding which category you fit into might just save your life. First, there are the accidentals. These are folks who never planned to set foot in a cave, but found themselves with no other choice. Maybe they got caught in a sudden blizzard while hunting. Maybe their car broke down in the mountains and they needed shelter for the night. Maybe they were fleeing some kind of disaster and a cave was the only protection available. These people often have the hardest time psychologically because they're not mentally prepared for what they're facing. The accidentals usually fall into 2 subgroups, the panickers and the adapters. The panickers spend their energy fighting the situation instead of working with it. They burn through their resources, physical, and mental, trying to make the cave into something it's not. The adapters, on the other hand, size up their new reality quickly and start making the best of it. Guess which group has the better survival rate? Second, there are the prepared. These are people who've studied survival, maybe done some cave exploration, and understand at least theoretically what they're getting into. They might be experienced hikers who've practiced wilderness skills, former military who've had survival training, or just folks who've spent time learning about emergency preparedness. They know caves are dangerous, but they also know how to mitigate some of those dangers. The prepared have a huge advantage, but they've got a dangerous weakness too: overconfidence. Sometimes knowing a little can be worse than knowing nothing, especially if that little bit of knowledge makes you take risks you shouldn't take. I've heard more than one search and rescue story about experienced outdoorsmen who got themselves into trouble because they thought they could handle more than they actually could. Third, there are the experts. These are professional cavers, geologists, search and rescue personnel, or people who've spent serious time underground. They understand not just the mechanics of cave survival, but the psychology of it. They know how caves behave, how to read the signs that spell trouble, and most importantly, they respect what they don't know. But here's the interesting thing. When it comes to long-term survival in a cave, we're talking weeks, not days. The category that matters most isn't your experience level, it's your mental approach. The folks who make it out alive are the ones who treat the cave like a partner, not an enemy. They work with the environment instead of against it. They stay humble, stay alert, and never assume they've got it all figured out. What we're going to cover over the next 7 parts, we're going to walk through every aspect of cave survival from the perspective of someone who's lived enough life to know that preparation beats panic every single time. We're not going to sugarcoat it, and we're not going to pretend it's easy, but we are going to give you the straight truth about what works, what doesn't, and why. In part 2, we'll talk about finding the right cave, because not all caves are created equal, and choosing the wrong one can kill you faster than staying out in the elements. You'll learn the 3-chamber rule that experienced cavers swear by, and how to spot the warning signs that mark a cave as a death trap. Part 3 covers those crucial first 48 hours when your body and mind are adjusting to a completely alien environment. We'll talk about the temperature shock that catches most people off guard, the psychological challenges that start almost immediately, and the decisions you make in those first 2 days that determine whether you'll last 2 weeks or 2 months. In Part 4, we'll dive into the invisible killers: water, air quality, and gas pockets that can put you to sleep permanently. You'll learn how to find safe water in a cave system, how to read the signs of bad air, and why good ventilation is literally a matter of life and death. Part 5 is about setting up housekeeping underground, fire management, food storage, creating livable space, and establishing the daily routines that keep you sane when you're living in permanent darkness. We'll talk about why cave fires follow different rules than campfires, and the ventilation tricks that separate the pros from the amateurs. Part 6 covers what happens when the cave fights back: flash floods, rock falls, cave-ins, and the wildlife encounters that nobody talks about in survival manuals. You'll learn how to read the warning signs that your shelter is about to become your tomb, and why some of the most dangerous cave creatures are the ones you can't see coming. In Part 7, we'll tackle the psychological breaking point that hits around week 3, when your body starts failing and your mind starts playing tricks. We'll look at real stories of people who faced that critical decision: stay put and risk slow death, or leave shelter and risk quick death, and what we can learn from both the successes and the tragedies. Finally, in Part 8, we'll cover the transition back to daylight and the practical wisdom that only comes from understanding what it really means to live underground. You'll get actionable advice about what to stockpile, what to avoid, and how to prepare for situations you hope you'll never face. The hard truth about cave survival. Before we go any further, let's get something straight. Cave survival is not a backup plan. It's not something you want to do. It's something you do when every other option has been eliminated, and it's something that will test every bit of knowledge, experience, and mental toughness you've built up over a lifetime. The caves don't care how handy you are with tools. They don't care that you survived 3 tours in Vietnam or that you raised 4 kids through the recession of the 80s. Caves have their own rules, their own dangers, and their own timeline. Respect those rules, and you might make it out with some hard-earned stories. Ignore them, and you might not make it out at all. But here's the thing that keeps me coming back to this topic. The same qualities that make a man successful in life. Patience, problem solving, the ability to stay calm under pressure, the wisdom to know when to push forward and when to wait. Those same qualities can mean the difference between life and death in a cave survival situation. You've already proven you can handle whatever life throws at you. You've weathered economic downturns, raised families, buried parents, fixed things that couldn't be fixed, and found ways to keep going when keeping going seemed impossible. Those skills don't disappear just because you're underground. If anything, they become more valuable. The question isn't whether you're tough enough to survive in a cave. The question is whether you're smart enough to do it safely, and whether you've got the right information when you need it most. What makes this different? There are plenty of survival manuals out there that'll tell you how to start a fire with 2 sticks, or which plants are safe to eat. Most of them are written by people who've never been hungry enough to consider eating anything they found growing in the wild, and a lot of the advice ranges from impractical to downright dangerous. This isn't one of those manuals. Everything we're going to cover comes from real experiences, not theoretical knowledge. We're talking about lessons learned by people who actually lived through extended cave survival, backed up by input from professional cavers, search and rescue teams, and the kind of practical experts you won't find writing books, but who know more about staying alive in difficult situations than anyone with a PhD in survival studies. We're also going to talk about cave survival from the perspective of someone who's not 25 years old, in perfect shape, and carrying a backpack full of specialized gear. We're talking about real-world survival for real people. People who might have arthritis, people who might be carrying a few extra pounds, people whose night vision isn't what it used to be, and people who need to factor in medications, chronic conditions, and the simple reality that recovery takes longer when you're not a young buck anymore. But don't mistake any of that for pessimism. Some of the most impressive survival stories I've come across involved people who were well past their prime, who succeeded not because they were the strongest or the fastest, but because they were the smartest. They understood that survival isn't about overpowering your environment, it's about outsmarting it. And that's a game where experience wins over youth every single time. The stakes we're playing for. I want to be clear about something from the start. We're not talking about this stuff for the thrill of it. We're not trying to romanticize cave survival or make it sound like some kind of adventure. The stakes are real and they're serious. According to the National Speleological Society, cave-related deaths in the United States average about 12 per year. That might not sound like much until you consider that very few people actually spend time in caves. And most of those deaths happen to experienced cavers who know what they're doing. Start adding in people who end up in caves because of emergencies, people who don't have proper equipment or training, people who are dealing with injuries or exhaustion or panic, and those numbers start looking a lot more sobering. But here's the flip side. People do survive extended periods in caves. They survive cave-ins, floods, getting lost in complex systems and situations that should have killed them. The difference between the survivors and the statistics often comes down to knowledge, knowing what to do, when to do it, and just as importantly, what not to do. That knowledge is what we're going to build together over the next 7 parts. Not because we want to end up in a cave, but because understanding cave survival gives us tools that apply to a whole range of emergency situations. The guy who knows how to manage ventilation and fire safety in a cave is going to have a better chance in a house fire. The woman who understands how to find and purify water in a cave system is going to be better prepared when the municipal water system fails. The person who's thought through the psychology of isolation and darkness is going to handle power outages, extended emergencies, and other crisis situations with a clearer head. Setting expectations. Before we dive into part 2, let me set some expectations about what we're going to cover and how we're going to cover it. First, we're going to be thorough. Cave survival isn't something you can learn in a 15-minute YouTube video, and it's not something where half knowledge is good enough. We're going to cover the details that matter, including some that might seem obvious but turn out to be life or death important when you're actually underground. Second, we're going to be honest about the risks and the limitations. There are some cave survival situations where the best preparation in the world won't be enough. There are some caves that are simply too dangerous to use as shelter under any circumstances. And there are some people who, for medical or physical reasons, shouldn't attempt cave survival, even as a last resort. We'll talk about all of that, because understanding your limitations is just as important as understanding your capabilities. Third, we're going to focus on practical, actionable information. You won't need specialized equipment or years of training to use what we're going to cover, but you will need to think clearly, stay calm under pressure, and be willing to work within the constraints of an environment that doesn't care about your comfort or convenience. Finally, we're going to treat this subject with the respect it deserves. Cave survival isn't a game, and the people who've lived through it or didn't live through it deserve more than sensational storytelling or wilderness fantasy. We're going to tell their stories honestly, learn from their experiences, and honor their memory by making sure their hard-won knowledge doesn't die with them. The road ahead. So that's where we're headed. 7 more parts that'll take you from complete beginner to someone who understands what it really takes to survive underground. Not just the mechanics of it, but the psychology, the decision-making, and the kind of practical wisdom that can only come from understanding how things actually work in the real world. In part 2, we're going to start with the most fundamental question. How do you find a cave that'll keep you alive instead of killing you? Because as it turns out, not all holes in the ground are created equal, and the difference between a good cave and a death trap often comes down to details that most people would never think to look for. We'll cover the 3-chamber rule, the warning signs that mark a dangerous cave, and how to evaluate a potential shelter the way a real estate agent evaluates a house. Except the stakes are a lot higher than whether you'll be happy with your mortgage payments. You'll learn why the most obvious caves are often the most dangerous, how to spot the subtle signs that indicate whether a cave is stable or unstable, and what to look for in terms of water sources, ventilation, and escape routes. We'll also talk about the kinds of caves to avoid entirely, no matter how desperate your situation might be. But most importantly, you'll start to understand how caves actually work, not as static shelters, but as dynamic systems that respond to weather, season, and time of day in ways that can either save your life or end it. That's coming up in part 2, Finding Your Underground Real Estate. Because when it comes to cave survival, location isn't just everything, it's the only thing that matters. You know that old saying about real estate, location, location, location. When it comes to cave survival, that saying becomes a matter of life and death. The difference between a cave that'll shelter you through a crisis and one that'll become your tomb often comes down to details that most people wouldn't notice until it's too late. I learned this lesson the hard way from a search and rescue veteran named Tom Hartley, who spent 30 years pulling people out of caves in the Missouri Ozarks. Tom told me about a case from 1987, 3 hunters who took shelter in what looked like a perfect cave during an ice storm. Big opening, dry floor, seemed stable as bedrock. They were found 4 days later, all 3 dead from carbon monoxide poisoning. The cave had poor ventilation, their fire had burned through the available oxygen, and what should have been their salvation became their grave. The thing people don't understand, Tom told me, is that caves aren't just holes in the ground. They're systems. They breathe, they flood, they shift, they trap gases. You don't just move into a cave. You have to understand how it works, or it'll kill you while you sleep. That conversation changed how I thought about cave survival entirely. Because Tom was right, choosing the wrong cave is worse than staying out in the elements. At least in the open, you can see what's coming. In the wrong cave, death comes invisibly, silently, and often without warning. The three-chamber rule. Professional cavers have what they call the three-chamber rule, and it's the single most important piece of advice you'll get about selecting a survival cave. Here's how it works. Never take shelter in any cave that doesn't have at least 3 distinct chambers or sections with clear airflow between them. Why 3 chambers? Because proper cave survival requires what engineers call redundancy. Backup systems for your backup systems. The first chamber, closest to the entrance, is your workshop area. This is where you will do anything that produces smoke, fumes, or dust. Cooking, tool making, processing materials. The second chamber, deeper in, is your living area. This is where you sleep, store supplies, and spend most of your time. The third chamber, if it exists, is your emergency area, your backup shelter in case something goes wrong with the first 2. But the chambers aren't just about organization, they're about air quality. Caves with multiple chambers and connecting passages create what cavers call thermal circulation. Warm air rises and flows deeper into the cave, while cool air sinks and flows toward the entrance. This creates a natural ventilation system that prevents the buildup of carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and other gases that can kill you. A single-chamber cave, no matter how large or comfortable it looks, is essentially a dead-end tube. Light a fire in there, and you're competing with that fire for oxygen. The combustion produces carbon monoxide, which is heavier than air and settles in low spots, exactly where you'll be sleeping. Even if the cave has a large entrance, dead air pockets can form in corners and alcoves, creating invisible death traps. I remember talking to a caver named Sarah Chen, who'd been exploring caves in New Mexico for over 20 years. She told me about finding a cave that looked perfect from the outside. Huge entrance, level floor, protection from wind and weather. But when she got inside and started testing the air circulation with a simple smoke stick, she discovered that the cave was what cavers call a lung cave, one that breathes in and out with atmospheric pressure changes, but doesn't have continuous airflow. I could have died in there on a beautiful day, she said. The entrance was so big that it felt like you were getting plenty of air. But 30 feet back, the air was completely stagnant. One small fire would have turned that place into a gas chamber, reading the warning signs. So how do you spot a death trap before it traps you? Experienced cavers have developed a checklist of warning signs that mark a cave as too dangerous for survival shelter, and these signs can save your life if you know what to look for. First, look at the entrance itself. A cave entrance that's perfectly round or perfectly horizontal is often a red flag. Natural cave entrances are usually irregular, formed by water flow, freeze-thaw cycles, and geological stress over thousands of years. Perfectly shaped entrances can indicate that the cave was formed by recent geological activity, meaning it might still be unstable. Pay attention to loose rock around the entrance. If you see a lot of rock debris, fresh-looking rockfall, or stones that move when you step on them, that's a sign of ongoing instability. Caves that are actively shedding rock aren't safe for long-term occupation. You might survive the night, but extended stay dramatically increases your chances of being caught in a rockfall. Look for evidence of water flow, even if the cave appears dry when you find it. Water stains on the walls, rounded stones on the floor, or debris caught up high near the ceiling all indicate that the cave floods during certain conditions. Flash flooding in caves is particularly dangerous because you often can't hear it coming, and the water rises faster than you can react. Check for what cavers call bad air indicators. Dead vegetation near the entrance, the absence of spider webs or insect activity, or a musty chemical smell can all indicate poor air quality. Some caves have natural gas seeps, hydrogen sulfide emissions, or other atmospheric problems that make them unsuitable for human occupation. Be extremely wary of caves with bat colonies. Bats themselves aren't dangerous, but their droppings create ammonia buildup that can be toxic in enclosed spaces. Plus, bats often choose caves with specific temperature and humidity conditions that might not be suitable for human survival. The geology lesson that could save your life. You don't need to be a geologist to survive in a cave, but understanding some basic cave geology can mean the difference between choosing a stable shelter and walking into a death trap. Limestone caves, the most common type in much of the United States, are generally the most stable for survival purposes. These caves were carved out by water over thousands of years, which means they've already survived a lot of geological stress. The rock is usually solid, the passages are often smooth and well-formed, and they typically have good drainage. But limestone caves have their own dangers. They're prone to sudden flooding because they're part of underground water systems. They can also have deep pits, underground streams, and complex passage systems where it's easy to get lost. Never assume that a limestone cave is automatically safe, but don't automatically rule it out either. Sandstone caves can be excellent for survival, especially in desert regions. They're often shallow, which means you won't get lost in complex passage systems, and they typically have good natural ventilation. But sandstone is softer than limestone, which means it's more prone to erosion and collapse. Look for sandstone caves with hard caprock overhead, a layer of harder stone that protects the softer sandstone below. Volcanic caves, including lava tubes, can be incredibly stable and well ventilated, but they often lack water sources and can have sharp, abrasive surfaces that make them difficult to live in comfortably. They also tend to have very consistent temperatures year-round, which can be either an advantage or a disadvantage depending on your situation. Caves in granite or other hard rock are usually very stable, but are often formed by fractures rather than water erosion. This means they might have unstable loose rock, and they often don't have the natural drainage that water-carved caves provide. The water question. Finding a cave with a reliable water source is like hitting the survival lottery, but it comes with its own set of challenges and dangers. Underground water can be some of the purest you'll find, filtered through rock and sand for miles, but it can also be contaminated with minerals, bacteria, or chemicals that'll make you sicker than no water at all. Fast-moving underground streams are usually your safest bet for drinking water. The movement prevents bacterial growth, and the constant flow means the water is being replenished rather than sitting stagnant. But even fast-moving cave streams can be contaminated upstream by animal waste, agricultural runoff, or industrial pollution that seeped into the groundwater system. Standing pools in caves are generally dangerous to drink from without purification. They might look crystal clear, but stagnant water in caves can harbor bacteria, parasites, and mineral concentrations that can cause severe illness. Plus, standing water in caves often indicates poor drainage, which increases the risk of flooding. Be extremely careful about cave formations like flowstone, where water seeps through the rock and creates mineral deposits. This water is often heavily loaded with dissolved minerals, calcium, magnesium, sulfur compounds, that can cause severe digestive problems. It might be safe to drink in small quantities, but it's not suitable for your primary water source. Here's something most people don't think about. The water sources that make a cave attractive for survival can also make it attractive to wildlife. Bears, mountain lions, and other large animals often use caves with water sources as dens or regular shelters. Signs of large animal activity, scratch marks, scat, worn paths, strong animal odors, should make you seriously reconsider whether that cave is worth the risk. Ventilation, the invisible lifeline. Air quality in caves is literally a matter of life and death, but it's also one of the hardest things to evaluate without proper equipment. Professional cavers carry gas detectors, but in a survival situation, you're going to have to rely on simpler methods to assess whether a cave has safe, breathable air. The smoke test is the most reliable field method for checking air circulation. Light a small fire, or even just a cigarette lighter near the cave entrance, and watch how the smoke behaves. In a well-ventilated cave, the smoke should move steadily deeper into the cave, or flow out through the entrance. depending on temperature differences and atmospheric pressure. If the smoke just hangs in the air without moving, that's a sign of poor ventilation. But here's where it gets tricky. Air circulation in caves changes with weather conditions, time of day, and season. A cave that has good airflow on a warm afternoon might have completely stagnant air on a cold night. This is because cave ventilation is driven by temperature differences between the cave interior and the outside air. When those temperature differences disappear, the airflow stops. Listen for the sound of moving air. In a well-ventilated cave, you should be able to hear a subtle whooshing or whispering sound, especially near the entrance or at passages that connect to other parts of the cave system. Complete silence can indicate stagnant air. Pay attention to humidity levels. Your breath should dissipate normally in a well-ventilated cave. If your breath hangs in the air like fog, or if you notice moisture condensing on the cave walls more than you'd expect, that can indicate poor air circulation. Be aware that air circulation patterns can reverse. Many caves breathe, inhaling during high atmospheric pressure and exhaling during low pressure. A cave that seems to have good airflow when you first explore it might have the airflow reverse a few hours later when the weather changes. The escape route reality check. Here's a sobering truth that every experienced caver knows. The entrance you came in through might not be the way you get out. Caves can change. Rockfalls can block entrances. Flooding can make passages impassable. Snow and ice can seal cave mouths shut. That's why professional cavers always look for alternate exits, and it's why you need to do the same thing when selecting a survival cave. Multiple entrances are obviously ideal, but they're not always available. What you're really looking for is what cavers call multiple egress options. Different ways to get out if your primary exit becomes blocked. Some caves have what are called chimney exits, vertical shafts that lead to the surface. These might not be obvious from inside the cave, and they might require some climbing to reach, but they can be lifesavers if your main entrance gets blocked. Look for evidence of airflow from unexpected directions. Air has to come from somewhere, and if you feel airflow from a passage that doesn't seem to lead to the main entrance, it might connect to another exit. Professional cavers call these breakdowns, areas where the cave ceiling has collapsed, creating openings to the surface that might not be visible from outside. But here's the critical thing. Don't assume that any passage or opening you can't fully explore is an escape route. More people have died in caves trying to escape through passages that turned out to be dead ends than have been saved by finding secret exits. If you can't see daylight or feel a strong draft, treat any unexplored passage as a potential trap, not a potential escape. Size matters, but not how you think. Most people assume that bigger caves are better for survival, more space, more air, more room to set up a comfortable camp. But experienced cavers know that cave size is a double-edged sword, and bigger isn't always better. Large caves can be harder to heat. Your body heat and fire heat have to warm a much larger volume of air, which means you'll burn through fuel faster and have a harder time staying warm. In cold conditions, a smaller cave that you can heat effectively might be much more comfortable than a large cave where your fire barely takes the chill off. Large caves often have more complex air circulation patterns, which can make fire management more difficult and create unexpected drafts or dead air pockets. They're also more likely to have multiple levels, passages, and chambers where you can get disoriented or lost. Small caves, on the other hand, can be claustrophobic and might not have adequate ventilation for fire use. They can also be more dangerous if you need to share space with your fire. Carbon monoxide buildup happens faster in smaller spaces. The sweet spot, according to most experienced cavers, is a cave system that gives you options. A main chamber large enough to move around comfortably, but not so large that it's impossible to heat. Connecting passages or alcoves that you can use for different purposes, and enough overall space that you don't feel trapped, but not so much space that you waste energy trying to keep warm. The wildlife factor. Every cave is habitat for something, and understanding what lives in your potential shelter can be crucial for both safety and long-term survival. Some cave wildlife is harmless or even beneficial. Some can kill you. Bats are the most common cave dwellers, and they're generally not dangerous to humans. In fact, bats can be beneficial because they control insect populations around the cave entrance. But large bat colonies create their own problems: noise, droppings, and potential disease transmission. Caves with active bat colonies also tend to have very specific temperature and humidity requirements that might not be comfortable for humans. Bears use caves for winter denning, and a cave that looks perfect in summer might already be spoken for when cold weather arrives. Signs of bear activity include scratch marks on cave walls, worn paths, scat, and strong animal odors. Never assume that a cave is unoccupied just because you don't see animals when you first explore it. Snakes, especially rattlesnakes in warmer climates, often use caves for shelter and hibernation. They can be difficult to spot in the dark recesses of a cave, and they might not rattle a warning if they're lethargic from cold temperatures. Some caves harbor more exotic wildlife, everything from mountain lions to porcupines. The key is learning to read the signs: tracks, scat, hair caught on cave walls, feeding debris, territorial marking. But here's something most survival manuals won't tell you. Sometimes sharing a cave with wildlife can be beneficial. Animals that use a cave regularly have already done the work of determining that it's safe, stable, and has adequate resources. Their presence can actually be a good sign that the cave is suitable for long-term occupation. The trick is learning which animals you can coexist with and which ones require you to find different shelter. The seasonal reality caves change with the seasons in ways that most people never consider, and a cave that's perfect for survival in summer can become a death trap in winter. Understanding these seasonal changes can mean the difference between choosing shelter that'll see you through a crisis and choosing shelter that'll make your crisis worse. In winter, many caves become warmer than the outside air, but they also become more humid and more prone to condensation problems. The constant temperature difference between the cave interior and the outside air can create ice dams at entrances, sealing you in or making exits dangerous. Spring brings snowmelt and increased groundwater, which means many caves that are dry in winter can flood during spring runoff. Flash flooding in cave systems can happen with little warning, and it's often impossible to escape once the water starts rising. Summer can bring its own problems, especially in hot climates where caves become refuges for everything from rattlesnakes to black bears seeking relief from the heat. The same thermal properties that make caves attractive to humans in extreme weather also make them attractive to wildlife. Fall weather changes can affect cave ventilation patterns, and caves that have good airflow during summer might develop stagnant air problems as temperature differences between inside and outside air decrease, making the final choice. So, how do you put all this information together and actually choose a cave that'll keep you alive? Professional cavers use what they call the overnight test. They spend a night in any cave they're considering for extended use, paying close attention to how conditions change from day to night. Obviously, in a survival situation, you might not have the luxury of testing a cave overnight before committing to it, but you can still apply the same principles. Spend at least a few hours in any cave before deciding to make it your shelter. Pay attention to how air circulation changes as outside temperatures change. Notice how sound carries, how light penetrates, how humidity levels fluctuate. Trust your instincts, but verify them with facts. If a cave feels wrong, too quiet, too damp, too unstable, there's probably a reason. But don't reject a cave just because it's unfamiliar. Some of the best survival caves look uninviting from the outside. Consider your specific situation and needs. A cave that might be perfect for someone fleeing a wildfire might be terrible for someone trying to survive a winter storm. A cave that's ideal for a single person might be inadequate for a family. And remember that choosing a cave is just the first step. Once you've found suitable shelter, you still have to figure out how to live in it safely. That's what we're going to cover in part 3, where we'll talk about those crucial first 48 hours when your body and mind are adapting to an environment that humans weren't designed to live in, because finding the right cave is only half the battle. The other half is learning how to make that cave your home without letting it become your grave. In part 3, we'll cover the temperature shock that catches most people off guard, the psychological challenges that start almost immediately, and the critical decisions you make in your first 2 days underground that determine whether you'll survive 2 weeks or 2 months. You'll learn why your first night in a cave is often the most dangerous, how your body responds to permanent darkness, and what happens when you wake up that first morning and realize that you've crossed a line you can't uncross. That's coming up next, the first 48 hours underground. Because knowing how to choose a cave is only the beginning, knowing how to survive in one is where things get really interesting. Part 3, the first 48 hours underground. There's a moment, and every cave survivor I've talked to describes it the same way, when the reality of your situation hits you like a physical blow. Maybe it's when you wake up that first morning, and for a split second, you can't remember where you are. Maybe it's when you realize that the darkness isn't going away when the sun comes up. Maybe it's something as simple as needing to use the bathroom and suddenly understanding that all the normal rules of civilized life just went out the window. That moment usually happens sometime during the first 48 hours, and how you handle it often determines whether you're going to make it out alive. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who studies survival psychology at the University of Colorado, told me something that stuck with me. The human mind has an amazing ability to adapt to almost any environment, but that adaptation process has a cost. During those first 2 days, your brain is essentially rewiring itself to function in conditions it was never designed for. Some people handle that transition smoothly. Others experience what we call reality shock, a psychological crash that can be as dangerous as any physical threat. The first 48 hours in a cave aren't just about setting up shelter and finding water. They're about managing the most dangerous period of cave survival, the period when your body and mind haven't yet adapted to your new reality, but the adrenaline that got you through the initial crisis has started to wear off. Most people think they understand what cold means. They've been through winter power outages. They've worked outside in freezing weather. They've felt the bite of a January morning when the furnace breaks down. But cave cold is different. It's a cold that goes deeper than skin, deeper than muscle, all the way down to your bones and your spirit. Caves maintain what geologists call ground temperature, roughly the average annual temperature of the region, usually somewhere between 45 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit in most parts of the United States. That might not sound extreme, but it's a temperature that never changes. Not when you're sleeping, not when you're working, not when you desperately need just a few degrees of warmth to stop your teeth from chattering. Your body is designed to handle temperature variations, warmer during the day, cooler at night, seasonal changes that give your metabolism a chance to adjust. In a cave, that variation disappears. You're dealing with constant, unrelenting cold that saps your energy 24 hours a day. But the real challenge isn't the temperature itself, it's the humidity. Cave air is often saturated with moisture, which means your body's natural cooling and warming mechanisms don't work the way they should. Sweat doesn't evaporate properly, which makes it harder to stay warm when you're active. Dry clothes become damp clothes, and damp clothes become cold clothes that actually pull heat away from your body instead of insulating you. I remember talking to a man named Robert Chen, who spent 6 days in a cave system in West Virginia after getting lost during a solo hiking trip. The cold was the worst part, he told me. Not because it was so extreme, but because it never stopped. I'd work hard setting up my camp, get warm and sweaty, and then I'd sit down to rest, and within 10 minutes, I'd be shivering again. It was like the cave was slowly sucking the life out of me, 1 degree at a time. Robert's experience illustrates something that most survival manuals don't adequately address. In cave survival, managing your body temperature isn't just about staying comfortable. It's about conserving the energy your body burns, trying to maintain its core temperature. And during those first 48 hours, when you're still figuring out how to live in this new environment, You're burning through energy at a rate you can't sustain for long. The darkness that changes everything. Humans are visual creatures. We navigate by sight. We judge time by light. We even regulate our sleep cycles based on natural light patterns. Take away light entirely, and fundamental parts of your brain start to malfunction. Most people have experienced darkness, power outages, camping trips, late nights in rural areas with no streetlights. But cave darkness is absolute. It's the kind of darkness where you can't see your hand in front of your face, where closing your eyes and opening them makes no difference whatsoever. It's darkness so complete that it becomes a physical presence, pressing against you from all directions. During those first 48 hours, your brain is trying to process this sensory deprivation, and the results can be disorienting in ways you wouldn't expect. Without visual cues, you lose track of time in ways that go beyond simply not knowing whether it's day or night. Minutes can feel like hours. Hours can pass in what feels like minutes. Your sense of space becomes distorted. A cave chamber might feel enormous or claustrophobic, depending on your mental state. Your balance and coordination suffer. Without visual reference points, simple tasks like walking across uneven cave floors become exercises in controlled falling. You bump into walls, trip over rocks you've already navigated successfully a dozen times, and find yourself becoming exhausted from the simple act of moving around safely. But the psychological effects are often worse than the physical ones. Darkness triggers primitive fears that most adults have learned to suppress. It makes sound seem louder and more threatening. It makes your imagination work overtime, creating dangers that don't exist while making you miss dangers that do. Sarah Hendricks, a search and rescue specialist who's pulled people out of caves in Kentucky and Tennessee for over 15 years, told me about the psychological profile that separates the survivors from the casualties. The people who make it out are the ones who learn to work with the darkness instead of fighting it. They develop routines. They use sound and touch to navigate. They find ways to measure time that don't depend on light. The ones who don't make it are usually the ones who waste all their energy fighting something they can't change. The sound of silence and what it does to your head. Because silence isn't like the quiet of a rural night or the hush of a library. It's a silence so complete that you start to hear your own heartbeat, your own breathing, the blood flowing through your ears. And in that silence, every sound you make, every footstep, every rustle of clothing, every clank of equipment seems magnified and threatening. During those first 48 hours, this acoustic environment plays havoc with your nervous system. Sounds that should be comforting, the crackle of a fire, the sound of your own voice, become harsh and intrusive in the cave silence. Sounds that would be barely noticeable on the surface, a distant drip of water, the settling of rock, become constant sources of low-level stress as your brain tries to identify potential threats. Many cave survivors report developing what psychologists call hypervigilance, a state of constant alertness where your nervous system is convinced that danger is imminent, even when you're relatively safe. This hypervigilance burns through mental and physical energy at an unsustainable rate, and it's one of the reasons why the first 48 hours are so exhausting. The absence of familiar sounds also disrupts your ability to judge time and distance. On the surface, we unconsciously use ambient noise, traffic, wind, birds, the hum of electrical equipment to orient ourselves in space and time. In a cave, those reference points disappear, leaving you adrift in a sensory void that your brain struggles to interpret. But here's where experience and preparation can make a huge difference. Veteran cavers learn to use the cave's acoustic properties to their advantage. They learn to navigate by the sound of their footsteps on different types of rock. They learn to identify changes in air circulation by the way sound carries. They learn to use their own voice as a tool for measuring distance and identifying obstacles. Setting up your underground home. The way you organize your space during those first 48 hours will determine how livable your cave becomes over the long term. But setting up a functional camp in a cave isn't just a scaled-down version of setting up a campsite on the surface. Caves have their own rules, their own challenges, and their own ways of killing you if you get it wrong. First priority is fire management, and this is where most people make potentially fatal mistakes. Cave fires behave differently than surface fires because of the enclosed space, the different air circulation patterns, and the way smoke and gases accumulate in underground spaces. Your fire location has to balance several competing requirements. It needs to be close enough to your sleeping area to provide warmth, but far enough away to prevent carbon monoxide poisoning. It needs to be positioned to take advantage of natural ventilation, but not so close to airflow that it gets blown out by cave drafts. It needs to be on stable ground that won't shift or collapse, but not so close to the cave walls that it damages the rock or creates a fire hazard. Professional cavers use what they call the smoke test for fire placement. Before you build your main fire, burn some small material, paper, dry leaves, small twigs, in different locations and watch how the smoke behaves. In the right location, smoke should rise and flow toward a cave passage or toward the entrance, indicating good ventilation. If smoke pools or hangs in the air, that location is too dangerous for fire use. Water management is your second priority, and it's more complex than just finding a reliable source. You need to think about water storage, water purification, and gray water disposal. Where does the dirty water go after you've used it for cooking, cleaning, and washing? Most caves with water sources have some kind of natural drainage, but you can't assume that dirty water will just disappear safely. Contaminated water can pool in low areas, creating health hazards and attracting unwanted wildlife. Gray water can also change the cave's natural ecosystem in ways that make your long-term survival more difficult. Food storage in caves presents unique challenges. The constant cool temperature is great for preservation, but high humidity can cause problems with mold and spoilage. The complete darkness means you can't visually inspect your food for signs of contamination. And the presence of wildlife, from insects to rodents to larger animals, means that any food storage has to be secure against scavengers. Many experienced cavers use what they call cache systems, multiple small food storage locations instead of one large cache. This reduces the risk of losing all your food to spoilage, wildlife, or flooding, and it gives you backup options if one cache becomes compromised. The bathroom question. Nobody likes to talk about it, but human waste disposal in a confined cave environment is a serious health and safety issue that has to be addressed from day one. Get this wrong, and you can contaminate your water supply, create disease vectors, or make your living space uninhabitable. The basic rule is simple. Human waste has to be managed so that it doesn't contaminate your water sources, your living spaces, or the cave environment in ways that threaten your long-term survival. But implementing that rule in a cave environment requires some planning and discipline. If your cave has good drainage and connects to a larger underground water system, you might be able to designate a waste area in a side passage or alcove that's downstream from your water source and far enough from your living area to prevent odor and disease problems. But you have to be absolutely certain about the drainage patterns. Water that seems to flow away from your camp might actually circle back through underground channels and contaminate your water supply. If your cave doesn't have reliable drainage, you're looking at more complex waste management solutions. Some experienced cavers use what they call midden systems, designated waste areas that are covered with dirt or debris after each use, essentially creating composting toilets that break down waste safely over time. The key is establishing these systems during your first 48 hours, before waste accumulation becomes a problem. Trying to retrofit a waste management system after you've already contaminated your living space is much more difficult and potentially dangerous. Sleep, the impossible dream. Getting quality sleep in a cave during your first few nights ranges from difficult to nearly impossible, and sleep deprivation quickly becomes one of your most serious survival challenges. Your body's natural circadian rhythms are completely disrupted by the absence of light cues. Your nervous system is on high alert because of the unfamiliar environment, and the physical discomfort of trying to sleep on stone surfaces makes rest elusive even when you're exhausted. Most cave survivors report that their first night underground is largely sleepless. You're hyper-aware of every sound, every change in air circulation, every unfamiliar sensation. Your mind races through worst-case scenarios, escape plans, and all the things that could go wrong. Even when physical exhaustion finally forces you into unconsciousness, the sleep is restless and unsatisfying. The second night is often worse than the first. The adrenaline has worn off. The reality of your situation has fully sunk in, and you're already dealing with the accumulated effects of sleep deprivation from the previous night. This is when many people experience what psychologists call adjustment disorder, anxiety, depression, and cognitive impairment that result from trying to adapt to a radically new environment. But there are strategies that experienced cavers use to improve sleep quality in cave environments. Establishing regular bedtime and wake-up times, even without light cues to mark the passage of time. Creating comfortable sleeping surfaces using available materials, pine needles, grass, even carefully arranged stones, can make the difference between a miserable night and restorative sleep. Body heat management becomes critical for cave sleeping. You're dealing with constant heat loss to the cold rock surfaces, but you also can't afford to burn through fuel keeping a fire going all night. Many cavers use what they call thermal mass systems, heating stones by the fire during the evening, then moving the warm stones to their sleeping area to provide radiant heat through the night. The mental game. Perhaps the most dangerous aspect of those first 48 hours is the psychological adjustment that has to happen before you can function effectively in cave conditions. Your mind has to accept that all the normal reference points of human life, daylight, regular meal times, comfortable temperatures, familiar surroundings, easy communication with other people, have temporarily disappeared. Some people make this adjustment smoothly. They treat it as a problem to be solved, focus on immediate practical needs, and maintain a steady emotional baseline, even in difficult conditions. Others experience what survival psychologists call environmental shock, a psychological crisis that can impair judgment, reduce problem-solving ability, and lead to dangerous decision-making. Environmental shock typically manifests during the second day. After the immediate crisis, adrenaline has worn off, but before you've established routines and coping mechanisms for cave life. Symptoms include anxiety, depression, difficulty concentrating, irritability, and what psychologists call catastrophic thinking, the tendency to assume that any problem or setback means certain doom. The key to managing environmental shock is what experienced survivors call task focus, keeping your mind occupied with concrete, achievable goals instead of dwelling on the big picture of your situation. Instead of thinking, I'm trapped in a cave and I might die here, you focus on specific tasks. I need to gather fuel for tonight's fire, or I need to check my water supply, or I need to organize my equipment. This task focus serves multiple purposes. It keeps your mind occupied and prevents the kind of rumination that leads to panic or depression. It gives you a sense of control and accomplishment, even in an uncontrollable situation. And it ensures that you're actually taking care of the practical needs that will keep you alive, the mistakes that kill. During those crucial first 48 hours, certain mistakes are so common and so dangerous that they're worth highlighting specifically. These are the errors in judgment that turn manageable survival situations into tragedies, and understanding them can mean the difference between a difficult experience and a fatal one. The most common fatal mistake is fire mismanagement. People who would never dream of using charcoal grills or gas heaters in enclosed spaces somehow convince themselves that wood fires are safer in caves. They build fires too large for their ventilation, they use too much fuel too quickly, or they fall asleep next to fires in enclosed spaces. Carbon monoxide poisoning in caves is silent, odorless, and deadly. The second most common mistake is water contamination. People drink from standing pools without purification. They contaminate their water sources with waste, or they fail to recognize the signs of mineral contamination that can cause severe illness. In a survival situation, Getting sick from bad water often turns a manageable crisis into a fatal one. Overexertion during the adjustment period is another killer. People push themselves too hard during those first 2 days, burning through energy reserves they can't replace, taking risks they wouldn't normally take because they're not thinking clearly, or injuring themselves because they're trying to do too much too fast in an unfamiliar environment. Equipment loss or damage is less immediately fatal, but can be just as dangerous over the long term. People leave critical gear near fires where it can be damaged by heat. They set equipment down in unstable locations where it can fall into crevices or water. They use tools inappropriately and break things they can't replace. But perhaps the most dangerous mistake is panic-driven decision-making. People make irreversible choices during those first 48 hours, leaving the cave to look for better shelter, exploring unfamiliar passages without proper precautions, or attempting rescue signals that actually reduce their chances of being found. The emotional stress of the first 2 days can impair judgment in ways that have deadly consequences. When things go wrong, despite your best planning and preparation, things will go wrong during your first 48 hours in cave survival. Equipment will fail, weather will change, you'll discover problems with your chosen shelter that weren't apparent initially. How you respond to these setbacks often determines whether they become minor inconveniences or major crises. The key is what emergency responders call adaptive problem solving. The ability to modify your plans based on changing conditions without losing sight of your primary survival goals. This means having backup plans for your backup plans and being willing to abandon strategies that aren't working in favor of approaches that might work better. For example, if your chosen fire location turns out to have poor ventilation, you don't keep trying to make it work. You find a new location, even if it means reorganizing your entire camp layout. If your water source becomes contaminated or inaccessible, you don't keep trying to use it. You shift to water conservation mode and start looking for alternatives. This adaptive thinking is easier said than done when you're dealing with sleep deprivation, environmental stress, and the psychological pressure of survival. It requires a kind of mental discipline that comes from experience and preparation, but it can be developed even in the middle of a crisis if you understand the principles. The turning point, somewhere around the end of the second day, if you've managed things correctly, something shifts. The cave stops feeling like an alien environment and starts feeling like shelter. The constant cold becomes something you can manage rather than something that's slowly killing you. The darkness becomes a known quantity rather than a source of constant anxiety. This turning point doesn't mean that cave survival becomes easy. You're still dealing with serious challenges that require constant attention and careful management, but it means that you've successfully made the transition from surface dweller to cave survivor. Your body has started to adapt to the environment. Your mind has developed coping strategies for the psychological challenges, and you've established routines and systems that make daily life possible. Recognizing this turning point when it happens is important because it marks the end of the most dangerous phase of cave survival. You're no longer fighting the cave environment, you're working with it. You're no longer burning through energy and resources trying to recreate surface conditions underground. You're learning to live within the constraints and opportunities that the cave provides. But reaching this turning point also means that you're committed to cave survival for the long haul. The adaptations your body and mind have made aren't easily reversible, and you've probably used up resources and energy reserves that you can't easily replace. From this point forward, cave survival becomes less about short-term crisis management and more about sustainable long-term living in an underground environment, setting the stage for long-term survival. The decisions you make and the systems you establish during those first 48 hours will determine how successful your long-term cave survival will be. These early choices have consequences that compound over time, either making your life progressively easier and safer, or creating ongoing problems that make survival more difficult. Fire management systems established during your first 2 days will determine how efficiently you can heat your living space, cook food, and provide light for essential tasks. Water purification and storage systems will affect your health and energy levels for as long as you're in the cave. Waste management systems will determine whether your living space remains sanitary and healthy or becomes contaminated and dangerous. Equipment organization and maintenance routines established early will determine whether your tools and supplies remain functional and accessible or deteriorate to the point where they're useless. Sleep and rest patterns will affect your physical and mental health for the entire duration of your cave survival. Perhaps most importantly, the psychological coping strategies you develop during those first 48 hours will determine how well you handle the ongoing stress of cave survival. The mental routines, the task focus, the adaptive problem-solving approaches, these become the foundation for everything that follows. Looking ahead, successfully navigating your first 48 hours in a cave is a significant achievement, but it's also just the beginning of a much longer and more complex survival challenge. In Part 4, we're going to dive into the invisible killers that can end your survival story even after you've successfully established your underground home. We'll talk about water, air quality, and gas accumulation, the things that can kill you silently and without warning, even in caves that seem perfectly safe. You'll learn how to recognize the early signs of air quality problems, how to find and purify water in cave systems, and how to manage the invisible hazards that claim more cave survivors than rockfalls or hypothermia. We'll also cover the cave's breathing patterns, how to read changes in air pressure and circulation, and what those changes tell you about weather conditions on the surface and safety conditions in your underground home. Because surviving those first 48 hours is just earning the right to face the deeper challenges of long-term cave survival. And some of those challenges, the ones you can't see coming, are the most dangerous of all. That's coming up in Part 4, water, air, and the things that'll kill you first. Because knowing how to establish yourself in a cave is only half the battle. The other half is learning to recognize and avoid the invisible dangers that can end your survival story before you even know they're there. In 1993, an experienced outdoorsman named Michael Torres took shelter in a cave system near Carlsbad, New Mexico, during a flash flood that had washed out the roads and made travel impossible. Torres had military survival training, 20 years of hunting and camping experience, and he'd chosen what appeared to be a perfect cave, dry, well-ventilated, with a small spring in the back chamber. He was found dead 4 days later. The cause wasn't hypothermia, dehydration, or injury. It wasn't a cave-in or wildlife attack. Michael Torres died from hydrogen sulfide poisoning, a gas that had been seeping into the cave through underground fissures connected to natural gas deposits. The gas was odorless at the concentrations that killed him, and by the time he might have noticed symptoms, it was too late to get to fresh air. Torres did everything right, according to conventional survival wisdom, but he died because he didn't understand the invisible killers that make cave survival different from any other kind of emergency shelter. He didn't know how to read the warning signs that marked his chosen cave as a death trap, disguised as salvation. That story stayed with me because it illustrates something that most survival training completely ignores. In cave survival, the things that'll kill you fastest are usually the things you can't see, smell, or hear coming. Water, air, and gas, the basic elements that sustain life on the surface, become complex, unpredictable dangers when you're living underground. The water that kills water is life, right? Find water, purify it, drink it, and you've solved one of your biggest survival challenges. Except in caves, where water can kill you in ways that most surface survival situations never present. Underground water systems are complex, interconnected networks that can change rapidly and unpredictably. The clear, cold spring that's flowing at a steady rate when you first discover it might be connected to surface drainage systems that can turn it into a raging torrent with little warning. The standing pool that looks perfectly safe might be contaminated with minerals, bacteria, or chemicals that won't make you sick immediately, but will kill you slowly over days or weeks. I learned about cave water hazards from Dr. Patricia Hendricks, a hydrogeologist who spent 30 years studying underground water systems in the American Southwest. Surface water follows gravity, she told me. Underground water follows geology. It can flow uphill, it can reverse direction, it can appear and disappear based on pressure changes that happen miles away. People who think they understand water because they've survived on surface sources are often the ones who get into the most trouble underground. The first rule of cave water is that there are no safe assumptions. That underground stream might look like any mountain creek, but it could be carrying dissolved minerals at concentrations that'll cause kidney failure. That crystal clear pool might be naturally filtered and perfectly safe, or it might be stagnant water that's been sitting in the cave for months, breeding bacteria and parasites. Fast-moving water is generally safer than standing water, but speed alone doesn't guarantee safety. I've heard about underground streams that flow through abandoned mine shafts, picking up heavy metals and industrial chemicals. I've learned about cave systems where fast-moving water is actually part of a geothermal system, carrying sulfur compounds and other minerals that can cause severe illness, even in small doses. The taste test that works for surface water sources can be dangerously misleading in caves. Some of the most toxic cave water tastes perfectly normal or even pleasant. Conversely, some perfectly safe cave water tastes terrible because of harmless mineral content. Color and clarity are equally unreliable indicators. Crystal clear cave water can be loaded with dissolved minerals or gases that make it unsuitable for drinking. Cloudy or discolored cave water might be perfectly safe, just carrying harmless sediment or organic matter. So, how do you evaluate cave water sources when all the normal indicators are unreliable? Experienced cavers use what they call the source evaluation method. Instead of trying to judge water quality by appearance, taste, or smell, you evaluate the water source itself. Look for signs that the water is part of an active, flowing system rather than stagnant pools. Water that flows in and flows out, that shows signs of regular level changes, that supports aquatic life. These are generally positive indicators. Water that sits in closed pools, that has no visible inflow or outflow, that shows mineral deposits around the edges. These are red flags for potential contamination. Pay attention to what's upstream from your water source. In cave systems, upstream might not be obvious, but look for signs that the water might be flowing through areas with animal activity, mineral deposits, or other potential contamination sources. Consider the geology of your cave system. Limestone caves often have naturally filtered water that's safe to drink. Caves in areas with mineral deposits, abandoned mines, or industrial activity might have water that's contaminated with heavy metals or chemicals. But even with careful source evaluation, cave water should always be purified if possible. Boiling is the most reliable method if you have fuel and fire capability. Chemical purification tablets work for biological contamination, but won't remove mineral contamination or chemical pollutants. Filtration systems can help, but many cave contaminants are dissolved at the molecular level and won't be removed by simple filtration. The air you can't see air quality in caves is literally a matter of life and death, but it's also one of the most difficult survival challenges to manage because the problems are often invisible, odorless, and develop gradually over time. The air we breathe on the surface is roughly 21% oxygen, 78% nitrogen, and about 1% other gases, including carbon dioxide. Those percentages stay remarkably consistent across different environments: mountaintops, valleys, forests, deserts. Your body is calibrated to function within a narrow range of atmospheric composition, and even small changes can have serious health consequences. Cave atmospheres can be radically different from surface air, and those differences aren't always immediately apparent. Carbon dioxide can accumulate in low-lying areas of caves, creating pockets of dead air that can cause unconsciousness or death. Oxygen levels can drop below safe thresholds, causing confusion, poor judgment, and eventual suffocation. Toxic gases, hydrogen sulfide, methane, carbon monoxide from fires, radon, can seep into cave systems from underground sources. The insidious thing about most air quality problems is that they develop slowly and affect your judgment before they affect your breathing. Carbon dioxide poisoning, for example, doesn't feel like suffocation. Instead, you gradually become drowsy, confused, and unable to think clearly. By the time you realize there's a problem, you might not have the mental clarity to solve it. Professional cavers use gas detectors to monitor air quality, but in a survival situation, you have to rely on simpler methods to assess whether your cave air is safe to breathe. The candle test is one of the oldest and most reliable field methods for checking oxygen levels. A candle flame requires roughly the same oxygen concentration that human lungs need to function properly. If a candle burns brightly, the air is probably safe. If the flame becomes weak or goes out, oxygen levels are too low for safe occupation. But the candle test only works for oxygen depletion. It won't detect toxic gas accumulation, and it requires you to have candles and the ability to light them safely. A more practical approach for cave survival is learning to recognize the physical signs of air quality problems before they become dangerous. Headaches, dizziness, and unusual fatigue can be early signs of carbon dioxide accumulation or oxygen depletion. Nausea, difficulty concentrating, and changes in your coordination can indicate the early stages of gas poisoning. Unusual drowsiness, especially during times when you should be alert, can signal dangerous air quality changes. But here's the challenge. Many of these symptoms are also signs of dehydration, exhaustion, hypothermia, and general stress, all common problems in cave survival situations. Learning to distinguish between air quality problems and other survival challenges requires careful self-monitoring and an understanding of how cave air circulation works, how caves breathe. Understanding cave ventilation is crucial for long-term survival, but it requires thinking about air movement in ways that most people haven't considered. Caves don't just contain air, they actively move air in complex patterns that change based on temperature, atmospheric pressure, and seasonal conditions. Most caves experience what's called thermal circulation, a process where temperature differences between the cave interior and outside air create air movement. During warm weather, the cool air in the cave is denser than the warm outside air, so the cave air flows out through lower entrances, while warm outside air enters through higher openings. During cold weather, this pattern reverses. This thermal circulation is what creates the natural ventilation that makes many caves safe for human occupation. But it's also what can make caves dangerous when the system doesn't work properly or when external conditions disrupt the normal airflow patterns. Changes in atmospheric pressure, the kind that happen before storms, during weather fronts, or with seasonal weather changes, can dramatically affect cave ventilation. A cave that has excellent airflow during stable weather might develop stagnant air problems when a low-pressure system moves through the area. Some caves are what cavers call breathing caves. They inhale and exhale air based on atmospheric pressure changes, like giant lungs. In these caves, air circulation can actually reverse direction multiple times per day, creating complex ventilation patterns that are difficult to predict without long-term observation. Wind speed and direction on the surface can affect cave ventilation, especially in caves with multiple entrances or connection to surface air through cracks and fissures. Changes in surface vegetation, like seasonal leaf cover or snow accumulation, can alter the way outside air enters cave systems. Understanding these ventilation patterns is crucial for fire management, gas safety, and general air quality in cave survival situations. Your fire location, your sleeping area, and your waste disposal systems all need to be positioned to work with the cave's natural airflow patterns, rather than against them. The invisible killers beyond the basic challenges of oxygen depletion and carbon dioxide accumulation, caves can harbor a variety of toxic gases that can kill quickly and without warning. These gases are often naturally occurring, seeping into cave systems through underground fissures, geological formations, or connections to mineral deposits. Hydrogen sulfide is probably the most dangerous because it can be present in lethal concentrations without being detectable by smell. At low concentrations, Hydrogen sulfide has a distinctive rotten egg odor, but at higher concentrations it can overwhelm your sense of smell, making it undetectable even as it's killing you. Hydrogen sulfide is heavier than air, so it settles in low-lying areas of caves where people are likely to sleep or take shelter. Methane is another common cave gas, especially in caves located in areas with natural gas deposits or organic matter decomposition. Methane itself isn't highly toxic, but it displaces oxygen and creates explosion hazards around open flames. Methane leaks in caves can create pockets of oxygen-depleted air that cause suffocation without warning. Carbon monoxide from improperly managed fires is probably the most common toxic gas problem in cave survival situations. Unlike surface fires, cave fires can produce dangerous carbon monoxide levels, even when they appear to be burning cleanly, because the enclosed space and altered air circulation patterns prevent proper ventilation of combustion gases. Radon is a radioactive gas that occurs naturally in many geological formations and can accumulate in enclosed spaces like caves. Short-term exposure probably isn't dangerous, but extended cave survival in areas with high radon levels could pose long-term health risks. The challenge with all these gases is that they're often undetectable without specialized equipment, and by the time symptoms appear, it may be too late to get to fresh air safely. Prevention is really the only practical approach, choosing caves with good natural ventilation, positioning fires correctly, and being alert to subtle changes in air quality that might indicate problems. Reading the cave's vital signs. Professional cavers learn to read a cave's air quality using subtle environmental cues that most people wouldn't notice. These techniques can be adapted for survival situations, giving you early warning of air quality problems before they become dangerous. Sound carries differently in air with different gas compositions. If you notice that sounds seem muffled or that your voice echoes differently than usual, it might indicate changes in air density that suggest gas accumulation or oxygen depletion. Changes in humidity levels can indicate air circulation problems. If your cave suddenly becomes more humid or less humid than usual, it might mean that the normal ventilation patterns have been disrupted. Wildlife behavior can be an early indicator of air quality changes. If bats, insects, or other cave-dwelling creatures suddenly become more active or less active than usual, they might be responding to air quality changes that you can't detect directly. The behavior of your fire can tell you a lot about air quality and circulation. A fire that suddenly starts burning differently, producing more smoke, burning less efficiently, or flickering in unusual patterns, might be responding to changes in air composition or circulation. Your own physical condition is also a monitoring tool. Changes in how easily you get winded, how well you sleep, how clear your thinking is, or how much energy you have can all be early indicators of air quality problems. The key is establishing baselines during your first few days in the cave, then monitoring for changes that might indicate developing problems. Small changes that develop gradually are often more dangerous than obvious problems because they affect your judgment before you realize there's a threat. Water. The long game. Finding water is just the beginning of cave water management. Storing, purifying, and conserving water in cave environments presents ongoing challenges that can affect your survival chances over the long term. Water storage in caves is complicated by the constant humidity, which can promote bacterial growth in stored water. The cool temperatures slow bacterial growth, but don't eliminate it entirely. Containers that would keep water safe for days on the surface might allow dangerous contamination in cave conditions. The minerals dissolved in cave water can cause long-term health problems, even if they don't make you immediately sick. High concentrations of calcium, magnesium, or other minerals can cause kidney stones, digestive problems, or mineral imbalances that affect your overall health and energy levels. Some cave water sources are seasonal, flowing strongly during wet periods, but drying up completely during dry seasons. Learning to recognize the signs of seasonal water sources, mineral deposits, worn channels, vegetation patterns, can help you plan for water scarcity before it becomes critical. gray water disposal becomes a long-term health issue in cave survival. The water you use for cooking, cleaning, and washing has to go somewhere, and in a confined cave environment, improper gray water disposal can quickly create sanitation problems that affect your health and make your living space uninhabitable. Water conservation techniques that work on the surface might not be practical in cave environments. Solar distillation obviously won't work underground. Dew collection is impossible. Rain catchment systems might not be feasible if your cave entrance is protected from precipitation. But caves also offer water conservation opportunities that aren't available on the surface. The constant cool temperature means you need less water for cooling. The high humidity means you lose less water through respiration and skin evaporation. The absence of wind means you don't need extra water to combat dehydration from wind exposure. Air quality management. Managing air quality in caves requires active monitoring and intervention, not just hope that the natural ventilation will be adequate. This is especially important for fire management, which is often essential for warmth, cooking, and psychological well-being, but which can quickly create dangerous air quality conditions if not managed properly. Fire location is critical for air quality safety. Fires need to be positioned where smoke and combustion gases can be carried away by natural air circulation, but not so close to airflow that the fire is constantly blown around or extinguished. The ideal fire location takes advantage of rising air currents to carry smoke away from living areas while maintaining stable burning conditions. Fire size needs to be carefully managed to match the cave's ventilation capacity. A fire that would be perfectly safe in open air can quickly consume available oxygen or produce dangerous levels of carbon monoxide in an enclosed cave space. Small, efficient fires are generally safer than large, dramatic fires. Fuel selection affects air quality in ways that most people don't consider. Different types of wood produce different amounts and types of smoke. Dry, seasoned hardwoods generally burn cleaner than softwoods or green wood. Avoid burning materials that might produce toxic fumes. Treated lumber, synthetic materials, anything that might have chemical contamination. Ventilation management sometimes requires active intervention. You might need to clear debris from air passages, create barriers to direct airflow, or even temporarily modify cave features to improve air circulation. But be very careful about making permanent changes to cave structure. What improves air circulation under one set of conditions might make it worse under different conditions. When the cave fights back, sometimes, despite your best efforts to choose a safe cave and manage air and water quality properly, the cave environment itself becomes dangerous. Weather changes, geological activity, or seasonal variations can turn a safe cave into a death trap. And recognizing these changes early is often the difference between adapting successfully and becoming another cave survival statistic. Sudden changes in water levels are often the first sign that your cave is becoming dangerous. Underground water systems can respond to surface conditions in ways that aren't immediately obvious. Heavy rains miles away can cause flash flooding in caves that appear to be completely dry. Seasonal snowmelt can dramatically increase water flow in cave systems. Even prolonged dry periods can cause problems if they alter the underground water table and affect the springs or streams you're depending on. Changes in air circulation patterns can indicate structural changes in the cave system or changes in surface conditions that affect ventilation. If air quality suddenly deteriorates, if normal airflow patterns change, or if you notice new drafts or dead air areas, it might mean that your cave is becoming unstable or that external conditions are affecting its safety. Temperature changes beyond the normal range can indicate that your cave is connected to geological activity or surface conditions in ways you didn't realize. Caves generally maintain very stable temperatures, so sudden warming or cooling can be a sign of problems ranging from underground fires to structural changes that are altering the cave's thermal properties. New sounds, dripping, rumbling, cracking, or echoing can indicate structural changes, water level changes, or other developments that might affect the safety of your cave. Caves are generally very quiet environments, so new sounds often indicate significant changes in the cave system. Wildlife behavior changes can signal environmental problems before they become apparent to humans. If bats suddenly abandon a cave, if insects become more or less active, or if you notice new animal activity, it might indicate changes in air quality, water availability, or structural stability that you need to investigate. The point of no return. There comes a moment in many cave survival situations when you have to decide whether to stay in your established shelter despite developing problems, or to abandon your cave and seek alternative shelter. This decision is often complicated by the fact that the problems that make your cave dangerous might also be affecting conditions on the surface. The decision to abandon a cave is never simple because you're giving up shelter that you've already invested time and energy in establishing. You're also potentially giving up water sources, established fire systems, and familiarity with the local environment. But staying in a cave that's becoming dangerous can be fatal. Air quality problems that are getting worse rather than better are usually grounds for immediate evacuation. If you're experiencing symptoms of gas poisoning, oxygen depletion, or carbon dioxide accumulation, and if those symptoms are worsening despite efforts to improve ventilation, you need to get to fresh air immediately, even if it means leaving your shelter. Water contamination or loss of water sources can force evacuation decisions, especially if you don't have adequate stored water to sustain yourself while looking for alternative sources. Dehydration kills faster than exposure in most survival situations, so losing reliable access to safe water often means you need to leave your cave and find alternatives. Structural instability, evidence of ongoing rockfall, ceiling collapse, or other geological activity, usually means immediate evacuation. Unlike other cave dangers, structural collapse can happen suddenly and without warning, giving you no opportunity to escape if you wait too long to leave. But the hardest evacuation decisions involve gradual deterioration of conditions that individually aren't immediately life-threatening, but collectively are making long-term survival increasingly unlikely. Rising water levels that aren't yet dangerous but are eliminating living space. Declining air quality that isn't yet toxic but is affecting your health and energy levels. Equipment failure or resource depletion that isn't yet critical but is reducing your long-term survival prospects. These decisions require the kind of judgment that comes from experience and careful monitoring of changing conditions. The key is recognizing the difference between temporary problems that can be managed and fundamental changes that make continued cave occupation unsafe. Preparing for the worst part of managing invisible cave dangers is preparing for scenarios where air quality or water safety suddenly become critical issues. This means having backup plans, emergency procedures, and the equipment and knowledge necessary to respond quickly when conditions deteriorate. Emergency evacuation plans need to account for the possibility that you might need to leave your cave quickly, possibly in conditions of poor visibility, compromised air quality, or other hazards. Know multiple routes out of your cave system. Have emergency supplies positioned so you can grab them quickly. Practice moving through your cave in darkness so you can navigate safely, even if you're dealing with impaired judgment from air quality problems. Emergency air quality procedures might include having a designated safe area where you can retreat if air quality in your main living area becomes dangerous. Understanding how to quickly improve ventilation by opening passages, redirecting airflow, or extinguishing fires safely. Knowing the signs that indicate you need to immediately evacuate to fresh air. Water emergency procedures include having backup water storage, knowing alternative water sources in your area, and understanding how to quickly purify questionable water sources when your primary water supply becomes unavailable or contaminated. Equipment redundancy becomes critical when you're dealing with invisible dangers. Backup methods for fire making, water purification, and light sources. Multiple ways to test air quality and monitor environmental conditions. Emergency supplies positioned in different locations so that problems in one area don't eliminate all your resources. But the most important preparation is mental, understanding that cave conditions can change rapidly and unpredictably, and maintaining the flexibility and judgment necessary to adapt to changing conditions before they become life-threatening. The skills that save lives. Successfully managing air and water quality in cave survival situations requires developing skills that go beyond basic wilderness survival. These are skills that can be learned and practiced, but they're also skills that require ongoing attention and refinement based on the specific conditions of your cave environment. Environmental monitoring becomes a constant, ongoing process rather than something you check once and forget about. Learning to recognize subtle changes in air quality, water conditions, and environmental factors that might indicate developing problems. Developing the habit of regularly testing and evaluating conditions rather than assuming that today will be like yesterday. Problem diagnosis skills help you distinguish between different types of air and water quality problems so you can respond appropriately. Understanding the difference between carbon dioxide accumulation and oxygen depletion, between bacterial contamination and mineral contamination, between temporary air circulation problems and serious ventilation failures. Adaptive problem solving helps you respond to changing conditions with creative solutions that work within the constraints of your cave environment. This might mean repositioning fires to improve air circulation, creating improvised water filtration systems, or modifying cave features to enhance natural ventilation. But perhaps most importantly, you need to develop what experienced cavers call situational humility. The understanding that caves are complex, dynamic environments that can surprise you no matter how much you know or how carefully you plan. Maintaining respect for the invisible dangers means staying alert, staying flexible, and staying ready to change your plans when conditions change. The foundation for everything else. Successfully managing air and water quality creates the foundation that makes everything else in cave survival possible. Without safe air to breathe and clean water to drink, all the other skills, fire management, food storage, equipment maintenance, psychological coping, become irrelevant. But managing these invisible dangers also teaches you the kind of systematic thinking and environmental awareness that applies to every other aspect of cave survival. Learning to read subtle environmental cues, to monitor changing conditions, to anticipate problems before they become critical. These skills will serve you well when you're dealing with fire management, wildlife encounters, structural hazards, and all the other challenges of living underground. In Part 5, we're going to build on this foundation by covering how to set up housekeeping underground, fire management, food storage, equipment organization, and the daily routines that make extended cave survival not just possible, but sustainable. Because knowing how to avoid the invisible killers is just the beginning of creating a livable underground environment. We'll cover why cave fires follow different rules than surface fires, how to create living spaces that work with cave conditions rather than against them, and how to establish the daily routines that keep you sane and healthy when you're living in permanent darkness. That's coming up in Part 5, Building Your Underground World. Because surviving the invisible dangers is just earning the right to tackle the visible challenges of making a cave your temporary home. There's a moment in every extended cave survival situation when you stop thinking of yourself as someone temporarily sheltering in a cave and start thinking of yourself as someone who lives in a cave. It's a subtle shift, but it changes everything about how you approach the practical challenges of daily life underground. I learned about this psychological transition from a man named Daniel Robertson, who spent 3 weeks in a cave system in Montana after an early winter storm stranded him while he was hunting alone. The first week, I was camping in a cave, he told me. I was still thinking like someone who was going home soon. I was making do, improvising, trying to tough it out until rescue came. But somewhere around day 10, I realized that this wasn't temporary anymore. This was my life, at least for now. That's when I stopped camping and started living. That shift from camping to living is what Part 5 is about, because there's a fundamental difference between surviving a few days in a cave and building the kind of underground living system that can sustain you for weeks or even months. The difference between those two approaches often determines who makes it out alive and who doesn't. Building a functional underground world requires understanding that caves aren't just outdoor environments with roofs. They're completely different ecosystems with their own rules, their own opportunities, and their own constraints. The strategies that work for surface camping not only don't work underground, they can be actively dangerous. Fire, the heart of your underground world. In surface camping, fire is useful but optional. You can cook on camp stoves, stay warm with modern sleeping gear, and navigate with flashlights. In cave survival, fire becomes the center of everything: heat, light, cooking, psychological comfort, and the focal point around which you organize your daily life. But cave fires are nothing like campfires. They burn differently, they behave differently, and they can kill you in ways that surface fires never will. The first rule of cave fire management is that you're not just managing the fire, you're managing the relationship between the fire, the air, and the enclosed space. Every cave fire creates a complex system of air circulation, heat distribution, and gas management that affects everything else about your underground living situation. Cave fire location is critical in ways that surface fire location never is. On the surface, you can build a fire almost anywhere that's reasonably safe and convenient. In a cave, your fire location has to balance multiple competing requirements that surface fires don't face. Your fire needs to be positioned where smoke can escape through natural air circulation, but not where drafts will make it difficult to maintain or will blow smoke into your living areas. It needs to be close enough to your sleeping area to provide warmth, but far enough away to prevent carbon monoxide poisoning. It needs to be on stable ground that won't shift or collapse, but accessible enough that you can tend it safely in darkness. Most importantly, your fire needs to be positioned to work with your cave's unique air circulation patterns. Every cave moves air differently, and those patterns can change based on weather conditions, atmospheric pressure, and time of day. A fire location that works perfectly under one set of conditions might become dangerous when conditions change. Professional cavers use what they call the smoke mapping technique to find optimal fire locations. You build small test fires in different potential locations and carefully observe how the smoke behaves under different conditions. You're looking for locations where smoke rises and flows steadily toward cave passages or entrances, indicating good natural ventilation. But smoke mapping takes time and fuel, resources you might not have in a survival situation. A faster method is to use natural air indicators, feeling for drafts with wet fingers, observing how dust or debris moves in air currents, listening for the subtle sounds of air movement through cave passages. The daily fire cycle. Managing fire in caves requires thinking about fire as an ongoing process rather than something you start when you need it. Cave fires need to be planned, maintained, and managed as part of a daily cycle that coordinates with your other survival activities. Most experienced cave survivors use what's called a banking system for fire management. Instead of building large fires that burn hot and die out, you maintain smaller fires that can be easily controlled and sustained over long periods. You bank the coals during periods when you don't need active heat or light, then revive the fire when needed. Banking coals in caves requires different techniques than surface coal banking. The constant humidity can make it difficult to keep banked coals viable. The enclosed space means you can't use some traditional banking materials that produce too much smoke. The limited airflow means banked fires can consume oxygen even when they're not producing visible flames. The most reliable cave banking method uses carefully arranged stones to create thermal mass around your fire pit. During active burning periods, the stones absorb heat. When you bank the fire, the warm stones help maintain coal temperature while reducing oxygen consumption. When you need to revive the fire, the warm stones help new fuel catch quickly. Fire scheduling becomes part of your daily routine in ways that surface camping never requires. You need active fires for cooking, which means coordinating meal preparation with periods when you can safely burn fuel without compromising air quality. You need fires for warmth during the coolest parts of your daily cycle, which in caves might not correspond to outside weather patterns. You need fires for light during periods when you're doing detailed work or moving around the cave. But you also need periods when fires are banked or extinguished to allow air quality to recover, to conserve fuel, and to reduce the ongoing risks that come with maintaining fire in enclosed spaces. Fuel management, the limiting factor. On the surface, fuel for fires is usually abundant. Fallen branches, dead wood, even debris from human activity. In caves, fuel becomes the limiting factor that determines how long you can maintain the fire systems that keep you alive. Cave fuel sources are often limited to what you can bring in from outside, what's available near the cave entrance, or organic debris that's washed into the cave system during floods or storms. This means that fuel conservation and efficiency become critical survival skills. Fuel selection for cave fires prioritizes efficiency over convenience. Hardwoods burn longer and produce more heat per unit than softwoods, but they might be harder to ignite and maintain. Dry fuel burns cleaner and produces less smoke, but it might not be available in cave environments where everything is constantly damp. Split wood burns more efficiently than whole logs because it provides more surface area for combustion. But splitting wood in caves presents challenges: limited space for swinging tools, difficulty managing debris, potential noise problems if you're trying to avoid attracting attention. Fuel preparation becomes an ongoing daily activity rather than something you do when you need it. This means processing available fuel during periods when you have good light and energy, storing prepared fuel in locations where it stays as dry as possible, and organizing fuel supplies so you can access them quickly when needed. Some experienced cavers use what they call fuel caching, processing large quantities of fuel when conditions are good, and storing it in multiple locations throughout the cave system. This provides backup fuel supplies and reduces the daily fuel gathering workload. But fuel caching in caves has to account for humidity, airflow, and potential flooding. Fuel stored in the wrong location can become waterlogged, moldy, or inaccessible when you need it most, creating light without wasting fuel. Light management in caves requires completely different thinking than surface lighting. On the surface, you can use electric lights, rely on daylight for many activities, and use fire primarily for heat and cooking. In caves, fire often has to provide all your light, which dramatically increases fuel consumption. The key to efficient cave lighting is understanding that you don't need constant light. You need light when and where you need it. This means developing daily routines that coordinate light needs with fire management, and learning to do many activities by touch and sound rather than sight. Task lighting uses small, focused fires or carefully positioned reflectors to provide light for specific activities: cooking, equipment maintenance, detailed work, without maintaining large fires that waste fuel and create air quality problems. Reflector systems can dramatically increase the effective light from small fires. Flat stones, metal surfaces, or even carefully positioned ice or snow can redirect and concentrate light from fires, making small flames provide useful illumination over larger areas. Light scheduling coordinates your light-requiring activities with periods when you're already maintaining fires for other purposes. Cooking, equipment maintenance, and detailed planning can all be scheduled during periods when you need fires for warmth, reducing overall fuel consumption. But the most important light management skill is learning to function effectively with minimal light, developing familiarity with your cave layout so you can navigate safely in darkness, organizing equipment so you can find what you need by touch, planning activities so that light-requiring tasks are batched together during efficient burning periods. Food storage, the underground pantry. Cave food storage takes advantage of the natural refrigeration that caves provide, but it also presents unique challenges that surface food storage doesn't face. The constant cool temperature in most caves slows bacterial growth and can significantly extend the safe storage life of many foods. The absence of temperature fluctuations reduces spoilage problems that plague surface food storage in hot weather. But high humidity in caves creates mold and decay problems that can ruin food supplies faster than bacterial spoilage. The enclosed environment means that odors from spoiling food can make your living space unbearable. The presence of wildlife, from insects to rodents to larger scavengers, means that food storage has to be secure against theft and contamination. Cave food storage systems need to address moisture control, pest control, and organization in ways that work within the constraints of underground environments. Moisture control often requires creating micro-environments within the cave that are drier than the general cave atmosphere. This might mean using natural air circulation to create drying areas, positioning food storage to take advantage of thermal effects, or creating improvised containers that protect food from ambient humidity. Pest control in caves means understanding what creatures share your environment and developing storage systems that deny them access to your food supplies. This is more complex than simple bear-proofing because cave ecosystems often include smaller creatures that can access containers that would be secure against larger animals. Organization becomes critical when you're managing food supplies in darkness or limited light conditions. You need storage systems that let you inventory supplies by touch, that keep different types of food organized and accessible, and that protect valuable food resources from being lost or damaged through handling errors. Many experienced cave survivors use what they call distributed storage, spreading food supplies across multiple cache locations rather than concentrating everything in one storage area. This reduces the risk of losing all your food to spoilage, flooding, wildlife, or other problems, and it can make food supplies more convenient to access from different areas of your cave system. Water systems. Beyond just finding water. We covered finding and purifying water in Part 4, but building a sustainable underground world requires developing water systems that go beyond just locating safe drinking water. Water storage in caves has to account for the constant humidity that can promote bacterial growth, the cool temperatures that slow evaporation but don't prevent contamination, and the limited container options available in survival situations. Gray water management becomes a critical health and sanitation issue when you're living in a confined space for extended periods. The water you use for cooking, cleaning, and personal hygiene has to go somewhere, and improper gray water disposal can quickly make your living space uninhabitable. Water conservation in caves is both easier and harder than surface water conservation. Easier because the cool temperatures and high humidity reduce your water needs. Harder because many surface water conservation techniques, solar distillation, dew collection, rainwater catchment, aren't available underground. Effective cave water systems often include multiple components: primary water sources for drinking and cooking, secondary sources for cleaning and washing, storage systems that prevent contamination while allowing easy access, and disposal systems that manage gray water without creating health hazards. Hot water systems can dramatically improve comfort and health in cave environments, but they require careful coordination with fire management to avoid wasting fuel or creating air quality problems. Simple hot water techniques, heating stones to warm water, using metal containers positioned near fires, can provide warm water for cleaning, cooking, and psychological comfort without requiring dedicated fuel. Equipment organization. Everything in its place. Managing equipment in caves requires different organizational principles than surface camping or even indoor storage. You're dealing with limited light, confined spaces, high humidity, and the need to access essential items quickly in potential emergency situations. The fundamental rule of cave equipment organization is redundancy and accessibility. Critical items, fire-making materials, lighting, emergency tools need to be stored in multiple locations so that problems in one area don't eliminate access to essential equipment. Weather protection becomes a constant concern in the high humidity environment of caves. Tools rust faster, fabrics develop mold problems, and materials that would last months on the surface can deteriorate in days underground. This means that equipment storage has to actively protect items from humidity damage, not just keep them organized. Inventory management in darkness requires organizational systems that work by touch and spatial memory rather than visual identification. This might mean using texture, size, or shape to identify items, developing consistent storage locations that you can find by feel, or creating systems that let you inventory supplies without handling every individual item. Emergency access planning ensures that critical equipment remains accessible even if parts of your cave system become flooded, blocked, or otherwise inaccessible. This means understanding which equipment is truly essential versus merely convenient, and positioning essential items where they'll remain available under emergency conditions. Many cave survivors develop what they call staged equipment systems, organizing equipment based on how frequently it's needed and how critical it is for survival. Daily use items are kept in easily accessible locations. Emergency equipment is distributed throughout the cave system, but marked or positioned so it can be found quickly when needed. Long-term supplies are stored in secure locations that protect them from humidity, wildlife, and other deterioration factors, creating living space. Transforming a cave from shelter into livable space requires understanding that comfort and functionality in caves follow different rules than surface living arrangements. Sleep systems in caves have to address the constant cold, the hard sleeping surfaces, the humidity that can make bedding damp and uncomfortable, and the psychological challenges of sleeping in complete darkness. Effective cave sleep systems often combine insulation from ground cold, moisture management for bedding materials, and psychological comfort features that help maintain mental health during extended underground living. Work areas need to coordinate with your fire and lighting systems to provide adequate illumination for detailed tasks, while managing the air quality and fuel consumption issues that come with extended lighting. This might mean creating specific work zones that can be efficiently lit when needed, or developing work routines that can be accomplished with minimal lighting. Storage areas need to balance accessibility with protection from humidity, wildlife, and other cave environmental factors. The storage solutions that work in dry, well-lit surface environments often fail in the constant humidity and darkness of cave environments. Privacy and personal space become important psychological factors during extended cave survival, even for solo survivors. Creating defined areas for different activities, sleeping, cooking, waste disposal, equipment storage, helps maintain psychological well-being and operational efficiency. But the most important aspect of creating livable cave space is understanding that you're working with the cave environment rather than trying to recreate surface living conditions underground. The most successful cave living arrangements take advantage of natural cave features: alcoves for storage, air circulation patterns for fire management, natural water drainage for sanitation, daily routines, structure in darkness. Without natural light cues to mark the passage of time, cave living requires establishing artificial routines that provide structure and help maintain physical and psychological health. Time management in caves often requires creating artificial markers for daily cycles. This might mean using fire schedules, meal timing, or activity planning to create consistent daily rhythms that help maintain circadian cycles and psychological stability. Task scheduling coordinates the various survival activities: fire management, food preparation, equipment maintenance, water collection, into efficient routines that make the best use of available time, energy, and resources. Physical activity routines become important for maintaining health and psychological well-being during extended cave living. The confined spaces and sedentary nature of cave survival can lead to physical deterioration and psychological problems if not actively addressed through planned physical activity. Personal hygiene routines help maintain health and psychological well-being, but they have to be adapted to work within the constraints of limited water, confined spaces, and cave environmental conditions. But perhaps the most important routine is what experienced survivors call environmental monitoring: regular checks of air quality, water conditions, structural stability, and other factors that affect safety and habitability. Making these checks part of your daily routine helps identify problems before they become critical. The psychology of underground living. The psychological challenges of extended cave survival go beyond the obvious issues of darkness and confinement. Building a sustainable underground world requires addressing the subtle psychological effects that accumulate over time and can undermine survival even when all the physical challenges are being managed successfully. Routine and structure become psychological anchors that help maintain mental health and operational efficiency. But the routines that work in cave environments are often different from surface routines, and they have to be consciously developed and maintained. Personal space and privacy, even in solo survival situations, help maintain psychological well-being. This might mean creating defined areas for different activities, establishing personal rituals that provide psychological comfort, or maintaining personal items that provide connection to normal life. Goal setting and progress tracking help maintain motivation and psychological stability during extended survival periods. This might mean setting daily goals for survival tasks, tracking progress on improving your living situation, or maintaining hopes and plans for eventual return to surface life. But the most important psychological aspect of building an underground world is what survival psychologists call environmental acceptance. Learning to work with cave conditions rather than constantly fighting against them. This doesn't mean giving up or becoming passive, but rather learning to find satisfaction and accomplishment in adapting successfully to a challenging environment. When your underground world becomes home, there's a point in extended cave survival when you realize that you've stopped thinking about your cave as temporary shelter and started thinking about it as home. This psychological shift is both a sign that you're adapting successfully to cave conditions and a potential danger signal that you're becoming too comfortable with a situation that should remain temporary. The positive aspects of this psychological adaptation include improved efficiency in managing cave living systems, reduced psychological stress from constant adaptation to unfamiliar conditions, and the kind of detailed environmental knowledge that comes from extended experience in a specific place. But the negative aspects can include reduced motivation to seek rescue or alternative shelter, overconfidence that can lead to dangerous risk-taking, and psychological difficulty in transitioning back to surface life when opportunities arise. Managing this psychological balance requires maintaining what survivors call exit awareness, constantly monitoring opportunities and preparations for leaving your cave survival situation, while still investing the effort necessary to maintain sustainable underground living systems. The foundation for long-term survival, successfully building an underground world, creates the foundation that makes extended cave survival possible. But it also sets the stage for the more complex challenges that emerge during long-term survival situations. In Part 6, we're going to cover what happens when your carefully constructed underground world faces the challenges that can destroy everything you've built: flash floods, structural collapse, wildlife encounters, and the seasonal changes that can transform a safe cave into a death trap. We'll talk about reading the warning signs that indicate your cave is becoming dangerous, how to respond to emergencies when you're already living in emergency conditions, and how to maintain multiple backup plans for situations where your primary survival strategies fail. Because building a sustainable underground world is just the beginning of extended cave survival. The real test comes when that world faces challenges that threaten to destroy everything you've worked to create. That's coming up in Part 6, when the cave fights back. Because knowing how to build an underground living system is only half the battle. The other half is knowing how to protect that system when the cave environment itself becomes your enemy.